Close your eyes for a moment and picture a map that is barely recognizable. Huge empires stretched like slow-moving shadows over the Americas, capitals lit by oil lamps, oceans still the highways of kings and merchants. In the space of a few heartbeats, a single human lifetime, that map will be redrawn again and again. Cities will be born, flags will be raised and lowered, slaves and soldiers will reshape nations with courage, cunning, and weary persistence. This is the story of how pockets of revolt, whispers of liberty, and the quiet decisions of anxious rulers turned colonies into republics, kingdoms into fragile states, and a hemisphere into a place where new ideas could take root and roar. Lean back, I will speak slowly. Let the names wash over you. Washington, Toussaint, Bolivar, San Martin, Hidalgo, Dom Pedro, and with each name you'll feel a door close on one world and open on another. Stay with me. The century ahead is long, but tonight we begin at the first page. The world of 1789 and the slow, inexorable birth of the modern Americas. In 1789, the United States had just placed a new constitution into the hands of its people and a cautious George Washington into the nation's highest office. The revolution that birthed that country was still a living memory. Its ideals, liberty, representation, the rule of law, were bold and fragile. Across the Atlantic, France convulsed into revolution and bloodshed, and the tremors of Republican talk reached farther than anyone imagined. Across the Caribbean, the sugar plantations hummed with the work of enslaved men and women. In the mines and haciendas of Spanish America, colonial hierarchies ordered life with an iron, inherited patience. The old European order still held much of the hemisphere in a long, quiet grip, but the threads were fraying. The new United States moved cautiously into its future. Washington's presidency, 1789-1797, established habits, a civilian leader who honoured term limits, the creation of a cabinet, and a determination to avoid entangling alliances. Alexander Hamilton, the finance architect, built a strong central credit system and sought to bind the nation with federal institutions. Thomas Jefferson and his allies worried that too much central power would mimic the monarchical coast they had fought. These debates about banks, tariffs, the reach of government, were not abstract parliamentary feuds. They shaped where roads were built, how trade flowed, and who grew rich. Early crises, the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s, conflicts over treaty obligations with Britain and France, and the tricky diplomacy of the Jay Treaty, tested the Republic's nerves. There was also expansion. In 1803, the United States completed the Louisiana Purchase, doubling its size overnight and setting out a long arc of continental ambitions. The purchase itself was tangled in a far wider drama. Napoleon Bonaparte's Europe was turbulent. His ambitions and shifting fortunes made colonial possessions a chessboard. France's loss of a powerful foothold in Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, the result of a furious, decisive slave revolution, made holding Louisiana less attractive. From 1791 onward, enslaved men and women in Saint-Domingue rose up under leaders like Toussaint Louverture. Their struggle was brutal and brilliant. They wrested control, fought European armies, turned plantation systems inside out, and in 1804 declared the first successful Black Republic in the modern era. That revolution sent shockwaves across the Americas. For European planters and slaveholders, it was an electric terror. For revolutionaries across Latin America, it was a fierce example that emancipation and independence could be won even in the teeth of imperial power. Spanish America felt the reverberations more quietly at first, then monstrously. For centuries, the Spanish crown had ruled through viceroys and a sprawling bureaucracy, extracting silver from the Andean mountains and sending wealth back to Europe. But in 1808, Napoleon's armies invaded Spain. King Ferdinand VII was deposed, and Joseph Bonaparte sat on the throne. The crisis in Europe created a political vacuum across the Atlantic. Without a clear, legitimate crown to obey, local elites in places like Buenos Aires, Caracas, and Bogotá began to form their own juntas, claiming to rule in the absent king's name, while nursing ideas of self-governance. What began as cautious municipal assertion quickly turned revolutionary. Creole elites, American-born descendants of Europeans who had long chafed under mercantile restrictions, now found opportunity to act. The years between roughly 1810 and 1825 would see a chain of uprisings, campaigns, and complicated negotiations that ripped empires apart. In Mexico, the cry of rebellion came from an unexpected source. On a morning in 1810, a parish priest, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, raised his voice in the small town of Dolores and issued the Grito de Dolores, the call that would ignite the Mexican War of Independence. Hidalgo's call brought together a startling coalition. Indigenous communities, mestizo artisans, lower-class labourers, and disgruntled Creoles who saw an opening. The insurgency surged, sometimes coarse and violent, sometimes idealistic and disorganized, sweeping toward Mexico City, but also revealing the fissures of social conflict. Leaders rose and fell. Hidalgo himself was captured and executed in 1811. José María Morelos carried the banner forward with a stronger political vision and a drive for social reform, but he too was captured and executed in 1815. It would be a mixture of military exhaustion, negotiation, and the shifting loyalties of Spain's own commanders that eventually opened the door to independence. In 1821, Agustín de Iturbide, a Creole officer who had once fought for the crown, brokered the Plan of Iguala and proclaimed Mexico independent, briefly becoming emperor before the new nation moved, albeit unsteadily, toward republicanism. South America moved under the leadership of striking and often contradictory characters. Simón Bolívar, a Venezuelan Creole inspired by Enlightenment ideas and wounded by exile, dreamed of a continent united. He fought through campaigns of astonishing endurance, the crossing of the Andes, the liberation of New Granada, and composed grand visions of a single Gran Colombia stretching from Panama to Ecuador. In Argentina, José de San Martín organized a different liberation arc. Winning independence in the Rio de la Plata region, he boldly crossed the Andes in 1817 to strike at Spanish power in Chile, and from there sailed north to help free Peru. Their joint efforts, though not always coordinated, culminated in the collapse of Spanish military rule across South America. Battles like Boyacá, 1819, and Carabobo, 1821, opened vaults of liberation. Ayacucho, 1824, would be remembered as the decisive blow that extinguished the last vestiges of Spanish authority in South America. Brazil's path diverged from its Spanish neighbours. When Napoleon invaded Portugal, the Portuguese royal family fled to Rio de Janeiro in 1808 and set up a court in exile. Brazil, suddenly the centre of imperial administration, was transformed, ports opened, institutions grew, and elites adjusted to new realities. When King John V. Halifax returned to Lisbon in 1821, he left his son Dom Pedro in Brazil. In 1822, faced with pressure from Portuguese authorities to recolonize Brazil, Dom Pedro, urged by nationalist sentiment and popular support, declared independence and was proclaimed Emperor Pedro I. The separation was relatively less violent than in Spanish America, but it set Brazil on a distinct path, an empire with a monarch who at first straddled liberal and conservative impulses. Across the hemisphere, the economies and societies were also reshaped. The invention of the cotton gin in the United States in 1793 had made short staple cotton vastly more profitable, fueling a boom in the American South that tied the region's prosperity ever more tightly to slave labor. In the Caribbean, sugar's merciless labor demands persisted, and the shock of Haiti's emancipation reverberated through planters, nightmares, and geopolitical strategy. Britain watched the Spanish Empire's collapse with commercial interest. A new world of independent republics promised markets and trade partners. British merchants and diplomats moved quickly in the 1820s to recognize new states and to secure trade arrangements, often acting as the hemisphere's leading external power by proxy. War and diplomacy in the north took a different shape. The War of 1812 between the United States and Britain, often called America's a second war for independence, erupted over maritime rights, impressment of sailors, frontier violence, and American ambitions in British-held North America. Battles raged from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Washington itself was burned in 1814. The Treaty of Ghent in December 1814 formally ended hostilities, and the subsequent American victory at New Orleans in January 1815 gave the United States a surge of national pride. Pride. The war's aftermath weakened the Federalist Party at home and helped push Americans into a new era of nationalism and economic self-confidence. In British North America, what would later become Canada, the war confirmed the value of union and self-defense, but also reinforced differences. Loyalists who had fled the American Revolution had reshaped Atlantic Canada and Quebec. The years after 1815 would see slow constitutional and political evolution, more local governments, economic development in timber and trade, and the beginnings of a distinctly Canadian political culture that balanced British imperial ties with North American realities. The question of slavery threaded itself dangerously through every change. While Haiti's revolution offered a path of abolition by upheaval, other routes were slower. Britain banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and moved to pressure others. Its navy began to patrol and intercept illegal slavers. In the United States, abolitionist voices grew louder, even as Southern planters hardened their grip on slavery as an economic institution. Latin American independence also opened space for emancipation debates. Some new republics moved to limit slavery, while others deferred the question, fearful of social collapse. Emancipation would be a long, uneven process, and the tensions it produced would recur like a slow, dangerous current beneath many new nations' surfaces. Politics in the newly independent lands rarely settled into tranquil order. The collapse of metropolitan control in Spanish America created striking institutional voids. Creole elites who sought political power often disagreed about what republics should look like: centralized or federal, conservative or liberal, clerical or secular. The result was a swirl of constitutions, juntas, provisional governments, proclamations of independence, and the rise of military caudillos who could command men and seize authority. The new republics borrowed ideas and symbols from Europe and North America, constitutions, popular sovereignty, national flags, but they grafted these onto societies riven by older inequalities, deep regional differences, and the scars of colonial extraction. By the early 1820s, a kind of hemispheric order was taking shape. Mexico stood independent and complicated. Newly formed nations from the Rio de la Plata to Colombia wrestled with the paradox of liberation, the joy of sovereignty and the crushing burden of forging institutions. Brazil had chosen empire and a constitutional monarchy of its own making. The United States looked westward, bigger and more confident after its continental leap. Britain loomed as an economic superpower that could shape recognition and trade. The remaining European powers, for the moment, had other priorities in the wake of Napoleonic restoration, but they watched the Americas with long interest. In 1823, that quiet watch invoked a formal response. President James Monroe stood in the cool light of a Washington summer and announced a doctrine that would echo through future centuries. The Western Hemisphere would no longer be a place for European recolonization. The Monroe Doctrine, short on military teeth and long on rhetorical posture, declared that the Americas were not open to new European conquests and that the political systems of the New World should be distinct from the old. It was as much a statement of aspiration as of power. The United States asserted a hemispheric guardianship it could not yet fully enforce. But for many in the Americas, the doctrine signalled a new rhetorical order, an affirmation that these nations were heirs to their own destiny. Yet the map was not settled. The youthful republics were fragile, economies battered by wartime disruption, treasuries nearly empty, social orders unsettled by emancipation and the movement of peoples. Indigenous nations, meanwhile, faced new waves of displacement as expanding states pushed into their lands. Their suffering and resistance would cast a long shadow into later decades. The men who led battles and signed constitutions did not always hold the reins of peace. They traded bullets for ballots, swords for constitutions, and often found that the work of making a state was slower, meaner, and more ordinary than war's grand drama. Listen to the quieter stories too. The woman who walked into a marketplace with her basket of fruit, the fisher who watched ships crowd the port, the artisan who learns to read a broadsheet calling for reforms, the freed black man who navigated a world oscillating between peril and possibility. The shape of nations is also the sum of millions of small decisions. Where to plant a field, whether to emigrate, how to educate a child, who to marry, decisions that lay the groundwork for political structures and cultural life over generations. As the clock of our story approaches 1825, the Americas are both remarkably new and perilously familiar. Empires have been ruptured, new flags fly, yet patterns persist. Dependence on commodity exports, the power of military leaders over civilian institutions, and the unresolved wound of slavery. Simón Bolívar's dream of a union of Spanish America flickers even as regionalism hardens. Mexico has claimed independence, but is already courting factional conflict. Brazil glides into empire under Dom Pedro, shaping a different experiment in constitutional monarchy. In North America, the United States tests the limits of expansion. The Caribbean, hemmed by plantation economies, stares at an uncertain future after Haiti's revolution. Everywhere, the efforts to make law, markets and societies function will shape the choices of ordinary people and the destinies of nations. So we close this first chapter with the image of a hemisphere on the move, armies marching, delegations signing, ships sailing, and families rearranging their lives around new centres of power. These years from 1789 to 1825 show how revolution spreads like a slow flame, catching dry tinder in some places, smouldering in others, blazing fully elsewhere. The century ahead will bring new conflicts, deeper transformations, and the widening ripple of industrial change. For now, rest with the sense that a vast, complicated experiment has begun. Dozens of peoples attempting to build self-rule in landscapes still scarred by conquest and shaped by old empires. The promise is intoxicating, the price already dear. When you are ready, we will continue the journey into the middle decades of the 19th century, a time of expansion and internal struggle as nations built the institutions that would either hold or splinter them. For now, breathe out. Let the names and images settle and know that this is only the beginning of a long, slow story of the Americas finding themselves. The year is 1825. The sound of gunfire and revolution has not fully faded, yet across the Americas there is a new silence, the silence of uncertain beginnings. Empires have collapsed. Constitutions are being drafted. Young nations test their fragile wings. Nations test their fragile wings. But behind the flags and parades lies hardship. Empty treasuries, devastated farmlands, divided societies. Independence was a triumph, but governing is a different kind of struggle. Tonight, we walk through those restless decades, from the mid-1820s to the 1850s, when the Americas wrestled not only with their past, but with the shape of their future. In North America, the United States had emerged from the War of 1812 more confident, yet still vulnerable to its own contradictions. The 1820s opened with an era often called the era of good feelings, but beneath the surface it was anything but simple. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had already revealed the dangerous line between free states and slave states, drawing a boundary at latitude 36 degrees 30. It was a temporary solution, not a cure, and everyone sensed the wound would bleed again. As settlers poured westward into the lands gained through the Louisiana Purchase, new territories brought the question, would they be free or slave? Expansion was not just about land. It was about identity, morality, and power. The presidency of Andrew Jackson, beginning in 1829, embodied this restless energy. Jackson, the rough-hewn general who had won fame at the Battle of New Orleans, represented a new populist style of politics. He claimed to speak for the common man against elites. His supporters celebrated him as a hero of democracy. His critics saw him as dangerously authoritarian. Jackson's policies were forceful, sometimes brutal. He dismantled the Second Bank of the United States, declaring it a den of privilege. He wielded the presidential veto with unprecedented power. And most tragically, he pursued an unrelenting policy of Indian removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 set in motion one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history. Native nations such as the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole were pressured and coerced to leave their homelands in the southeast and move west of the Mississippi. Some resisted legally, even winning cases in the Supreme Court. But Jackson ignored rulings and pressed forward. The forced marches, the most infamous known as the Trail of Tears, carried thousands through hunger, disease, and death toward lands in present-day Oklahoma. Whole communities were uprooted, their cultures battered but not destroyed. This episode revealed the raw power of expansionist America and its willingness to sacrifice indigenous peoples to the hunger for land. At the same time, the US economy was transforming. Canals like the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, linked markets, making it possible to ship goods faster and cheaper than ever before. Railroads began to appear in the 1830s, first short and local, then sprawling. Industry grew in the north, while the south doubled down on cotton. The cotton gin's invention in 1793 had made short staple cotton profitable, and by the 1830s, the South had become the world's leading supplier. This cotton kingdom was built upon the labour of millions enslaved, their lives bound to an economic machine that enriched planters and fed British textile mills. South of the United States, Mexico staggered under the weight of its independence. The nation had declared freedom in 1821, but unity was elusive. Regional elites clashed, military leaders rose and fell, constitutions were written and rewritten. The brief empire of Agustin de Iturbide gave way to a republic, but the republic was shaky. The 1820s and 1830s saw constant political instability, with presidents replaced frequently and centralist and federalist visions colliding. One major fracture point lay in Texas, where Anglo-American settlers, invited earlier under Spanish rule, clashed with the Mexican government over language, law, and above all, slavery. The seeds of the Texas Revolution were already germinating. Farther south, Central America too struggled to define itself. After independence from Spain, the region attempted to unite as the Federal Republic of Central America, 1823-1841. It was a bold dream of shared government from Guatemala to Costa Rica. But divisions of geography, economics and identity proved stronger than unity. By the 1830s, the Federation was fragmenting, leaving behind separate republics that would follow their own turbulent paths. In South America, the heroes of liberation had not found rest. Bolívar, El Libertador, presided over Gran Colombia, a vast republic stretching across modern Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador and Panama. Yet his dream of unity unravelled almost as soon as it was born. Regional leaders balked at central authority, rivalries tore at the seams. Bolívar lamented that governing America was like ploughing the sea. By 1830, Gran Colombia had collapsed into its constituent nations. Bolívar himself died in despair, convinced that the independence he fought for had yielded only fragmentation. Argentina, Chile and Peru followed their own unsettled courses. Caudillos, charismatic military leaders, became central figures ruling through patronage and force. Juan Manuel de Rosas in Argentina, for example, dominated politics in the 1830s and 1840s, embodying both populist appeal and harsh repression. Chile stabilized somewhat under conservative leadership after its wars of independence, building institutions that proved more durable. Peru, caught between internal divisions and external threats, drifted in and out of conflict. The Andes remained a theatre of both grand ambition and fragile statecraft. Brazil, by contrast, stood apart with its imperial experiment. Dom Pedro I had declared independence in 1822, but his reign was troubled. In 1831, facing unrest, he abdicated in favour of his young son, Pedro II. For years, a regency governed, a time marked by regional revolts such as the Farroupilha Rebellion in the south and uprisings in the northeast. But as Pedro II matured, he would provide Brazil with a relatively stable monarchy, steering it toward a balance of modernization and tradition. Unlike much of Spanish America, Brazil kept both territorial integrity and continuity of government, though beneath this surface, slavery and inequality festered. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the shadow of Haiti loomed. Its revolution had secured independence and abolition, but the new nation faced isolation. Many countries, fearful of encouraging their own enslaved populations, refused to recognize Haiti. The United States withheld recognition until 1862. Economically, Haiti struggled, weighed down by demands for indemnity from France and the decline of its plantation system. Yet Haiti remained a beacon of possibility, proof that people in bondage could rise and win their freedom. free. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, European colonies endured. Britain, France, the Netherlands and Spain clung to their possessions. Sugar plantations still demanded labour, and the transatlantic slave trade, though officially banned by Britain in 1807, persisted illegally. So, the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron patrolled against slavers, freeing thousands, but the practice was stubborn. In Cuba, Spanish rule held firm. Indeed, Cuba's economy grew stronger in these decades, making it a jewel Spain was desperate to keep. Enslaved Africans were imported in large numbers to feed the sugar boom, even as abolitionist voices grew louder worldwide. By the 1840s, change quickened. The United States embraced a new phrase, manifest destiny, the belief that the nation was destined to expand across the continent. This vision drove settlement westward, justified wars, and sharpened the debate over slavery. In 1846, war broke out with Mexico. The Mexican-American War, 1846-1848, was swift and decisive. American forces captured Mexico City. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded vast territories, present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. For Mexico, it was a staggering loss. For the US, it was a continental triumph, but one that reignited fierce debates. Would slavery extend into these new lands? Canada, meanwhile, evolved in a quieter rhythm. After the War of 1812, loyalty to Britain remained strong, but demands for more self-government grew. In 1837-1838, small rebellions broke out in Upper and Lower Canada, fueled by frustration with oligarchic rule. Though quickly suppressed, they revealed discontent. Britain responded with reforms, gradually granting more responsible government. The union of Upper and Lower Canada in 1841 marked a step toward the Confederation that would eventually arrive in 1867. In these decades, the indigenous peoples across the hemisphere faced relentless pressure. In the US, they were pushed westward, confined to reservations, or engaged in desperate resistance, such as the Seminole Wars in Florida. In Canada, treaties were signed that ceded vast lands to settlers. In Latin America, indigenous communities navigated complex systems of tribute, land loss, and occasional revolt. Their histories in these years were stories of endurance under immense strain, often written out of national myths, but present in the lived reality of villages and frontiers. By the 1850s, the Americas had been remade. The revolutions of the early century had given birth to dozens of republics and one empire. Borders had shifted dramatically. Slavery, though abolished in Haiti and restricted elsewhere, remained entrenched in the US. Brazil and Cuba, promising future conflict. Economies tied ever more closely to global markets made nations vulnerable to booms and busts. Railways, telegraphs, and steamships shortened distances and bound societies together in new ways. Yet beneath these changes lay fragility, political instability in Latin America, sectional tensions in the US, and the unresolved place of indigenous and enslaved peoples across the hemisphere. It was a time of both hope and unease. The Americas had claimed independence, but they had not yet secured peace with themselves. The questions of who belonged, who ruled, and who would define the future were not settled. They were merely postponed, waiting for the storms of the mid and late 19th century. And as the 1850s closed, storm clouds gathered. The United States sliding toward civil war, Mexico lurching between reform and reaction, South America restless under Cordelos, and the Caribbean trembling under the weight of slavery's last days. The age of revolution had passed, but the age of reckoning was about to begin. The 1850s opened like a stage set for drama. Across the Americas, tensions simmered, economies shifted, and nations stood at crossroads. The revolutions of independence were behind them, yet the questions those revolutions had left unresolved pressed forward with sharpened urgency. Could free and slave societies coexist? Could republics stabilize without collapsing into dictatorship? Could the dreams of liberty survive the hard realities of war, inequality, and ambition? Between the 1850s and the end of the American Civil War in 1865, the hemisphere would witness profound transformations. Some born of violence, others of political reform, all of them shaping the modern destinies of the nations we know today. In the United States, the 1850s were a decade of rising fire. The Compromise of 1850 had attempted to quiet disputes by admitting California as a free state, while enforcing a harsher fugitive slave law to placate the South, but compromise only sharpened division. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened new territories to the possibility of slavery, unleashing a rush of settlers who fought not only for land, but for ideology. A bleeding Kansas became a battlefield of militias, towns burned, families murdered, a civil war in miniature that foreshadowed the greater one to come. Political institutions strained. The once mighty Whig Party collapsed, torn apart by the slavery question. A new force emerged, the Republican Party, founded in the 1850s on opposition to the expansion of slavery. Its rise marked a profound realignment in American politics. Meanwhile, fiery voices grew louder. In the South, defenders of slavery claimed it was not just necessary, but righteous. In the North, abolitionists demanded its end, sometimes peacefully, sometimes through direct action. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, electrified public opinion, portraying the cruelty of slavery in human terms that no statistic could soften. Events accelerated in 1859 when John Brown, an abolitionist radical, attempted to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to spark a slave uprising. His raid failed, and he was captured and executed, but his martyrdom shook the nation. To the South, Brown was proof of Northern extremism. To many Northerners, he was a prophet of justice. The election of 1860 brought the crisis to breaking point. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. His platform opposed the expansion of slavery, though he promised not to interfere where it already existed. For many Southern leaders, his victory was intolerable. Before Lincoln even took office, South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. Within months, 6 other states followed, forming the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as president. War came in April 1861, when Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The United States was torn in two, and the bloodiest conflict in its history began. The American Civil War was not only a clash of armies, it was a clash of systems. The North, with its growing industry, dense railroads and larger population, fought to preserve the Union. The South, with its economy tied to slavery and cotton exports, fought for independence and the right to maintain its social order. Battles raged across fields and forests, from Bull Run to Antietam, from Gettysburg to Vicksburg. Soldiers fought in mud, hunger and fear, while families at home endured shortages and uncertainty. Slavery, at first not officially the Union's war aim, soon became inseparable from the conflict. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate-held territory free. It was a strategic move as well as a moral one. It deprived the South of labor, encouraged the flight of enslaved people to Union lines, and invited black men to enlist in the Union Army. By war's end, nearly 200,000 African Americans had served, their courage and sacrifice undeniable proof of their claim to freedom. The war also carried international echoes. Britain and France watched closely, their textile industries dependent on Southern cotton. The Confederacy hoped for recognition and aid, but European powers hesitated, wary of backing a cause so tied to slavery. Instead, the Union's naval blockade and military victories ensured the South remained diplomatically isolated. By 1865, the war's toll was immense. Cities burned, fields lay in ruin, families mourned the dead. In April, after 4 years of carnage, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Days later, Abraham Lincoln, who had carried the Union through its darkest trial, was assassinated in Washington. The war ended, but the struggle to rebuild the nation and to define freedom had only begun. While the United States wrestled with civil war, Latin America faced its own upheavals. Mexico, in particular, was a land of constant turmoil. The 1850s were marked by the Reform War, 1857-1861, a conflict between liberals and conservatives over the future of the Republic. Liberals, led by Benito Juárez, sought to reduce the power of the Catholic Church and military, promote equality before the law, and modernize the nation. Conservatives resisted fiercely, defending traditional privileges and hierarchies. The war was bloody and divisive, But in the end, Juarez and the liberals prevailed, laying the groundwork for a secular and reformed Mexico. Yet victory was fragile. Foreign debts and instability invited intervention. In 1861, Napoleon III of France seized the opportunity to establish a French-backed monarchy in Mexico, placing Archduke Maximilian of Austria as emperor. This French adventure would define the 1860s in Mexico, colliding directly with Juarez's republican resistance and testing the principles of sovereignty across the Americas. Elsewhere in Latin America, transformation continued under the shadow of Cordillo. In Argentina, the long conflict between federalists and centralists persisted, shaping the rise of leaders like Justo José de Aguirre and the eventual decline of Juan Manuel de Rosas. Chile moved through the mid-century with relative stability, its conservative republic consolidating institutions. In Peru and Bolivia, cycles of military coups and alliances kept politics unsettled, while economic booms, especially from guano exports in Peru, temporarily enriched states but sowed new dependencies. Brazil, under Emperor Pedro II, entered a period of remarkable stability compared to its neighbours. His reign, beginning in the 1840s and maturing through the 1850s and 1860s, saw economic growth, cultural flowering, and the slow but steady movement toward abolition. Yet slavery remained entrenched, and the empire's veneer of harmony masked deep inequalities. Still, Pedro II Brazil offered a striking contrast to the turbulence of Spanish America. In the Caribbean, the old order held but wavered. Cuba, still a Spanish colony, thrived on sugar, but also endured the cruelties of slavery longer than most. The Dominican Republic, after decades of shifting sovereignty, declared independence from Haiti in 1844, only to face new trials in maintaining stability. Across the islands, the presence of European powers, Britain, France, Spain, ensured the Caribbean remained entangled in global politics, trade, and empire. The hemisphere as a whole, by the mid-19th century, was deeply interconnected. The American Civil War influenced cotton markets worldwide. European interventions in Mexico challenged the Monroe Doctrine. Immigrant waves from Europe reshaped cities from Buenos Aires to New York. Railroads, steamships, and telegraphs shrank distances, weaving together economies and politics in ways unthinkable only decades before. By 1865, the Americas stood transformed. The United States had preserved its union and, at least in law, ended slavery. Mexico had survived reform but faced the shadow of European empire. South America's republics remained restless but resilient, their identities forged in the fires of Cordillo rule and economic change. Brazil's empire, stable for now, would eventually face its own reckonings. Across the Caribbean, slavery's chains still clung, but abolitionist winds were rising. The revolutions of the early 19th century had given birth to nations. The mid-century struggles defined whether those nations could endure. The cost was staggering: blood, upheaval, dislocation. But from these years of fire and reform, the Americas moved closer to the shape we recognize today, a hemisphere marked by diversity, division, and unending change. Part 4, 1865-1890s. The year 1865 marked both an ending and a beginning. In the United States, the Civil War was over, but the questions it had raised, freedom, equality, and national unity, were far from resolved. Across the Americas, nations found themselves grappling with similar struggles. How to modernize economies, how to manage diversity, how to balance liberty with order. The period from 1865 to the 1890s was an age of rebuilding, transformation, and ambition. It was also an age of violence, exclusion, and resistance as new states expanded over old communities, particularly indigenous peoples. In the United States, Reconstruction began. It was a bold, messy, and contested attempt to rebuild the South and redefine citizenship. Abraham Lincoln's assassination had left Andrew Johnson as president, a man less committed to radical change. Congress, dominated by radical Republicans, sought to extend civil rights to freedmen and to remake Southern society. Amendments to the Constitution marked revolutionary progress. The 13th abolished slavery, 1865. The 14th established birthright citizenship and equal protection, 1868. And the 15th granted black men the right to vote, 1870. For a moment, the vision seemed real. Freedmen voted, held office, and built schools, churches, and businesses. The South saw its first experiment in interracial democracy, yet backlash was swift and violent. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities, while Southern elites resisted land reform and clung to old hierarchies. Federal troops enforced Reconstruction governments, but as Northern commitment waned in the 1870s, a redemption movements restored white control. By 1877, with the compromise that resolved a disputed presidential election, Reconstruction ended. The South entered the long era of Jim Crow segregation, where the promises of freedom remained unfulfilled for generations. At the same time, the United States pushed relentlessly westward. The post-war decades were the era of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, of industrial expansion and of settlers moving into lands long inhabited by native nations. For indigenous peoples, the period was catastrophic. Battles like Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors defeated Custer, became legendary acts of resistance. But despite such victories, U.S. policy, from forced relocations to broken treaties, overwhelmed native societies. By the 1890s, the massacre at Wounded Knee, 1890, symbolized the tragic collapse of armed resistance. Native peoples endured, but their sovereignty was crushed, their lands seized, and their cultures subjected to harsh assimilation policies. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canada was born. In 1867, the British North America Act united Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick into the Dominion of Canada, a self-governing confederation within the British Empire. It was not yet a fully independent nation, but Confederation marked the beginning of Canada's path towards sovereignty. The Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in 1885, stitched the vast land together from coast to coast. But as in the United States, expansion meant dispossession for indigenous peoples and confrontation with resistance movements, notably the Red River and Northwest rebellions led by Louis Riel and the Métis people. Latin America in these decades pursued modernization with zeal, but also with contradictions. Leaders spoke of order and progress, seeking to build railroads, attract European immigrants, and expand exports of commodities like coffee, sugar, and nitrates. In Argentina, liberal elites pushed forward massive immigration schemes and agricultural expansion on the Pampas, but only by waging the conquest of the desert against indigenous peoples of Patagonia, a campaign that echoed the US frontier wars, Nessa Wars. In Chile, expansion into Mapuche lands followed similar logic, while Chile's military and economic strength grew, setting the stage for regional dominance. Brazil, still under Emperor Pedro II, entered what historians call its a second empire, marked by stability and modernization. Slavery, however, persisted long after most of the hemisphere had abolished it. Debates raged, resistance grew, and international pressure mounted. By the 1880s, gradual steps, like the Free Womb Law, 1871, and the Sexagenarian Law, 1885, chipped away at the institution. Finally, in 1888, the Golden Law abolished slavery entirely, making Brazil the last nation in the Americas to do so. The following year, the monarchy itself fell, and Brazil became a republic. Mexico, after surviving French occupation and the reign of Emperor Maximilian, executed in 1867, re-established its republic under Benito Juárez. His presidency symbolized resilience and reform, but political instability remained a constant. By the 1870s, Porfirio Diaz rose to power, ushering in the long Porfiriato. Diaz modernized Mexico with railroads, foreign investment, and industrial growth, but at the cost of authoritarian rule, deepening inequality, and harsh repression of dissent. The seeds of revolution were quietly being sown. The Caribbean, too, was in flux. In Cuba, the 10 Years' War, 1868-1878, began as a struggle for independence from Spain, fueled by resentment over slavery and colonial rule. Though the rebellion was suppressed, it kept the dream of independence alive, linking Cuban struggles with the broader currents of anti-imperialism and abolition. In Puerto Rico, smaller revolts erupted, while the Dominican Republic struggled with repeated interventions, occupations, and internal divisions. By the 1890s, the hemisphere looked transformed. The United States had emerged as an industrial giant stretching from Atlantic to Pacific. of course. Canada had stitched itself together as a new dominion, though still tethered to Britain. Latin America's republics, though fragile, had survived decades of chaos and now pursued modernization with ambition. Brazil had abolished slavery and shed its empire. Mexico stood under Diaz's authoritarian but modernizing grip. Yet beneath the surface of progress lay contradictions. Indigenous nations had been defeated but not erased. Their resistance was etched into memory. Freed people across the Americas had won emancipation, but true equality remained elusive. New elites enriched themselves through exports and foreign investments, but vast majorities lived in poverty. Railroads and telegraphs tied nations together, but widened the gap between rural and urban, rich and poor. The age of Reconstruction, Confederation, and modernization was one of bold visions and unfinished struggles. By 1900, the Americas were undeniably different from the world of 1865, more industrial, more connected, more ambitious. But they were also burdened with unresolved tensions that the coming century would expose in revolutions, reforms, and wars yet to come. Part 5, 1890s-1914, the closing years of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th were a hinge of history for the Americas. They were years of expansion and ambition, years when empires shifted and republics sought their place in the world. Railroads and telegraphs hummed, factories grew louder, cities swelled, and new classes of workers, immigrants, and intellectuals reshaped societies. But they were also years of violence, imperial conquest, and deep inequalities. In this era, the United States transformed into a global power, Latin America wrestled with nationalism and modernization, and the Caribbean became a crossroads of empires. By the eve of the First World War, the hemisphere stood more connected than ever, and poised to enter the storms of the 20th century. The United States had emerged from the Civil War an industrial powerhouse, and by the 1890s, its factories, railroads, and farms were unmatched in scale. Yet with power came restlessness. Expansion had carried the nation to the Pacific, but a new frontier was sought abroad. Many Americans spoke of a manifest destiny not only as a continental vision, but as a global one. Writers and politicians argued that the United States had a duty to spread civilization, commerce, and democracy, ideas that cloaked strategic and economic ambitions. The Navy, once modest, was modernized into a steel fleet. Thinkers like Alfred Thayer Mann, in The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, argued that national greatness depended on naval strength and overseas bases. The moment of transformation came in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. The conflict began in Cuba, where rebellion against Spanish rule had simmered since the 10 Years' War. By the 1890s, Cuban revolutionaries, led by figures like José Martí, pressed for independence once again. American newspapers, in a wave of yellow journalism, sensationalized Spanish atrocities and stirred public opinion. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898, killing over 250 sailors, outrage swept the United States. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became the cry. The war that followed was swift and decisive. In Cuba, US troops landed and fought alongside Cuban rebels, winning battles at places like San Juan Hill, where Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders became legendary. At sea, the modern US fleet crushed Spain's navy, first in the Caribbean and then in the Philippines, where Admiral Dewey's victory at Manila Bay signaled America's arrival in Asia. By the Treaty of Paris, Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States, while Cuba gained formal independence, but under heavy US influence through the Platt Amendment, which allowed Washington to intervene in Cuban affairs. The war was short, but its consequences were vast. The United States had become an imperial power, with colonies and protectorates spanning the Caribbean and Pacific. Debates raged at home. Some celebrated America's new role, others denounced imperialism as a betrayal of Republican ideals. For the peoples of Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba, the new era meant promises of modernization, but also subjugation to foreign power. The momentum of 1898 carried into the next decade. The United States turned its eye to Central America, where the dream of a canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific had long simmered. The French had failed disastrously in the 1880s, but by the early 1900s, American engineering and political will revived the project. In 1903, US support for Panamanian independence from Colombia cleared the way. The new Republic of Panama, heavily dependent on Washington, signed a treaty granting the United States control of the canal zone. Construction began under harsh tropical conditions. Thousands of workers, many brought from the Caribbean, toiled amid disease and danger. By 1914, the Panama Canal was complete, a triumph of engineering that shortened global trade routes and cemented US influence in the hemisphere. This era also marked the rise of Theodore Roosevelt's assertive foreign policy, often summarized as a speak softly and carry a big stick. Through the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, 1904, the United States claimed the right to intervene in Latin American nations to preserve stability and order, especially in cases of debt to European powers. In practice, this meant US occupations, financial oversight, and military interventions across the Caribbean and Central America, in the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Haiti, and beyond. For Washington, it was about protecting trade and security. For many Latin Americans, it was a new form of imperialism, dressed in the language of guardianship. Meanwhile, Latin America itself was far from passive. Across the continent, nations pursued modernization projects, attracted foreign investment, and built railroads and ports. Argentina and Uruguay prospered from booming beef and grain exports, drawing waves of European immigrants who reshaped the cultural landscape of cities like Buenos Aires and Montevideo. Chile, enriched by nitrate exports, became a regional power, while Brazil, now a republic after 1889, balanced modernization with the legacy of slavery's abolition. Mexico, under Porfirio Diaz, dazzled with railroads, glittering boulevards, and foreign capital. But beneath the surface, peasants and workers groaned under exploitation, setting the stage for revolution in the next decade. Nationalism stirred alongside modernization. Intellectuals and reformers sought to define identities distinct from Europe and the United States. In Mexico, thinkers debated how to blend indigenous and European heritage into a unified national culture. In the Caribbean, leaders like Martí, before his death in 1895, and others dreamed of a Latin America united against imperial domination. These currents of nationalism were often suppressed by oligarchies and dictatorships, but they endured, fueling future movements. Indigenous peoples, however, paid a heavy price during this era of progress. In Argentina, the conquest of the desert pushed Mapuche and other groups off their lands. In Chile, the final subjugation of the Araucania ended centuries of resistance. In the United States and Canada, native communities faced forced assimilation through reservation systems and residential schools. The wars were over, but the policies of erasure continued, seeking to strip indigenous peoples of language, culture, and autonomy. The Caribbean remained a patchwork of empires and struggles. Puerto Rico adapted to life as a US possession, caught between promises of citizenship and limited autonomy. Cuba wrestled with the contradiction of independence under US oversight, its politics turbulent and its sugar economy dependent on American markets. In the Dominican Republic and Haiti, instability opened the door to repeated interventions and foreign pressures. Across the islands, migration, trade, and culture tied the region ever more tightly to global currents. By the 1910s, the hemisphere stood on the threshold of a new era. The United States was no longer a regional player, but a global power. Its navy patrolling oceans, its corporations investing abroad, its interventions reshaping neighbors. Latin America, though often under the shadow of the North, nurtured its own ambitions, balancing modernization with the stirrings of social discontent and nationalism. Canada had grown steadily within the British Empire, increasingly confident in its autonomy, but still linked to London. Brazil, Argentina, and Chile dreamed of greater influence, while Mexico simmered toward revolution. The assassination of an archduke in 1914 would set the world ablaze, and the Americas, bound by trade, diplomacy, and migration, would not remain untouched. The years from the 1890s to 1914 were years of construction, of canals, railroads, industries, and empires. They were also years of contradiction, where promises of progress coexisted with oppression, and where independence was shadowed by new forms of domination. As the 20th century opened, the Americas stood taller, louder, and more connected than ever before. But beneath the glitter of modernization lay tensions that would erupt in revolutions, struggles, and wars yet to come. Part 6, 1914-1918, The Americas and the Beginning of World War I. The summer of 1914 found the Americas watching a distant storm gather across the Atlantic. Few in the hemisphere imagined how deeply the Great War, as it came to be called before the name of World War A even existed, would shape their nations. In Europe, old empires clashed with industrial ferocity, but in the New World there was hesitation, calculation, and an uneasy awareness that the ocean no longer insulated them from global upheaval. For the United States, the outbreak of war posed an immediate dilemma. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed neutrality in August 1914, insisting that America should be impartial in thought as well as in action. The country had little appetite for foreign entanglements. Yet neutrality proved complicated. Millions of immigrants had come from the very nations now at war, and loyalties divided communities. Irish Americans despised Britain, German Americans sympathized with the fatherland, while many others leaned toward the Allies. At the same time, the economic pull was irresistible. Britain and France turned to American farms and factories for food, munitions and supplies, while trade with Germany dwindled under the British blockade. Neutrality, in practice, leaned toward the Allies. Latin America, too, declared neutrality almost universally at first. Most governments hoped to stay out of a conflict that seemed distant and incomprehensible, but the war touched them nonetheless. Coffee from Brazil, nitrates from Chile, beef and wheat from Argentina, sugar from Cuba, all became critical exports to fuel the European war machine. The boom in demand enriched landowners and exporters while creating inflation and hardship for workers at home. Neutrality brought profits, but also new vulnerabilities to global markets. Canada, unlike its southern neighbour, had no choice. So, as part of the British Empire, it was automatically at war the moment Britain declared it on Germany in August 1914. For Canadians, this was both a duty and an opportunity. Waves of volunteers rushed to enlist, driven by loyalty to the Crown, a sense of adventure, or the hope of steady pay. The Canadian Expeditionary Force sailed for Europe, where it would endure the mud and horror of trench warfare, earning a reputation for courage at battles like Ypres and the Somme. At home, the war effort mobilized industry and agriculture, while deepening tensions between English and French Canadians over conscription and national identity. In the Caribbean, the war was both distant and immediate. Islands like Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados, still British colonies, sent soldiers and labourers to serve in the war effort. Others, like Puerto Rico, felt the weight of their imperial ties to the United States, though America itself remained neutral for the moment. For many Caribbean people, the war offered both opportunity and hardship. Jobs in shipping and agriculture expanded, but the presence of European navies turned the region into a strategic chessboard. German raiders prowled the Atlantic, and Allied powers tightened their grip on colonial economies. The early years of the war were marked by American hesitation. Wilson urged peace, even offering to mediate between the warring powers. But events slowly drew the United States closer to involvement. German U-boats waged unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking merchant ships bound for Britain. In May 1915, the sinking of the British liner Lusitania killed nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. Outrage flared, though Wilson resisted calls for war, securing instead a German pledge to limit attacks. Still, the sense grew that neutrality could not last forever. The war also influenced domestic debates. In the United States, preparedness advocates argued for strengthening the Army and Navy, while anti-war voices insisted that America should avoid the slaughter of Europe. In Mexico, still reeling from revolution, leaders like Venustiano Carranza balanced neutrality with suspicion, wary of both US power and European intrigues. German diplomats, in fact, sought to exploit such tensions, laying the groundwork for the infamous Zimmermann telegram that would later propose an alliance with Mexico against the United States. For Latin American elites, the war reinforced old debates about modernization and dependency. Was prosperity built on exports too fragile? If Europe descended into chaos, could nations truly claim sovereignty when global markets dictated their fortunes? Intellectuals pondered these questions as they watched the guns of August echo across oceans. By 1916, the war had become total. The casualty lists from Verdun and the Somme shocked the world. The scale of destruction, the mechanized slaughter, seemed unimaginable. In the Americas, sympathy for the Allies deepened, especially as German tactics grew more ruthless. At the same time, economic ties bound nations ever more tightly to the conflict. US banks extended massive loans to Britain and France, making financial stakes inseparable from political ones. South American economies surged and strained under wartime demand, reshaping labor markets and stirring unrest among workers whose wages failed to keep pace with prices. Neutrality, then, was never simple. The Americas were tied to the war through trade, finance, migration, and empire. The question was not whether they were affected, but how deeply they would be drawn in. And for the United States, the tipping point was drawing near. By the closing months of 1916, the Americas could no longer stand as passive onlookers. The war in Europe had reached a stalemate, yet the intensity only grew. Verdun and the Somme had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, and the appetite of the belligerent powers for resources, food and money seemed endless. Across the Atlantic, in New York and Washington, in Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro, leaders debated what neutrality truly meant when the global order was convulsing. In January 1917, Germany made a fateful decision. Desperate to break the British blockade, the Kaiser's government announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. Any ship bound for Allied ports, neutral or not, risked destruction beneath the waves. For the United States, this was intolerable. Wilson, who had just won re-election under the slogan, "He kept us out of war," now faced a direct challenge to American rights and security. German U-boats quickly sank several US merchant vessels. At the same time, a secret message crossed the Atlantic, the Zimmermann telegram. In it, Berlin promised Mexico the recovery of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if it joined Germany against the United States. When the British intercepted and revealed the note in March, American outrage erupted. Wilson finally asked Congress for a declaration of war in April 1917, proclaiming that the world must be made safe for democracy. The United States was in the war, though its army was small and unprepared for the titanic struggle awaiting in Europe. Mobilization began on a scale never before seen. Millions of young men drafted under the Selective Service Act, factories converted to war production, railroads and farms reorganized to feed and arm the Allies. The nation that had long prided itself on avoiding European entanglements was now bound to the fate of the Western Front. Canada, already bleeding from years of combat, welcomed the arrival of American allies, but also braced for further sacrifice. In 1917, the Canadian Corps captured Vimy Ridge, a costly but symbolic victory that became a touchstone of national pride. At home, however, divisions deepened. The conscription crisis of 1917 pitted English Canadians, who largely supported compulsory service, against French Canadians, many of whom resisted being forced into a war they felt little connection to. Riots broke out in Quebec, foreshadowing tensions that would shape Canadian politics for decades in politics for decades. Latin America's role shifted gradually. Most nations clung to neutrality, but German submarine warfare strained patience. When Brazilian ships were attacked in 1917, Brazil declared war on Germany, becoming the only South American nation to formally enter the conflict on the Allied side. Brazilian warships patrolled the Atlantic, and thousands of workers produced goods for the Allies. Other countries, like Argentina and Chile, remained neutral but wrestled with fierce internal debates. Landed elites often leaned toward Britain due to economic ties, while nationalist and immigrant groups sometimes expressed sympathy for Germany. Mexico remained a unique case. Still recovering from revolution, racked by civil strife, and deeply suspicious of US intentions, its leaders refused to be drawn into the war. Carranza rejected the German offer in the Zimmermann telegram, recognizing it as a dangerous trap, but he also maintained neutrality, seeking to preserve Mexico's sovereignty in a period of weakness. For Washington, Mexican neutrality was a relief, but US a relief. Mexican relations remained tense, shaped by border raids, punitive expeditions, and oil interests. The Caribbean, too, felt the shifting tide. American influence expanded in Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Territories where US troops and administrators increasingly managed local affairs under the banner of stability and wartime necessity. Thousands of Caribbean men were recruited or volunteered for service in European armies, often relegated to labor battalions but still playing vital roles in the Allied war machine. The war became, in subtle ways, a channel for imperial powers to extend control over the region. By 1918, the full force of American entry was being felt. Convoys protected by US destroyers began to turn the tide against German U-boats. On the Western Front, American troops, the Doughboys, arrived in growing numbers, bringing fresh morale to exhausted allies. At battles such as Château Thierry, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, US soldiers fought with ferocity, though at a terrible human cost. More than 100,000 Americans would die in the war, a shocking toll for a nation so new to global conflict. Latin America, though less directly involved, also faced wartime transformations. Inflation worsened as shipping disruptions and Allied demands strained economies. Labor strikes and protests spread in Argentina, Chile, and elsewhere, as workers demanded higher wages and fairer treatment. Intellectuals and politicians debated the meaning of the war. Was it a clash of imperial powers irrelevant to Latin America, or a struggle for principles like democracy and national self-determination? Some saw in Wilson's rhetoric about a new world order echoes of their own aspirations for sovereignty, while others suspected it masked a new form of US dominance. In November 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice ended the slaughter in Europe, but its echoes reverberated across the Americas. Canada mourned 60,000 dead, yet emerged with a stronger sense of national identity, no longer merely a colony, but a people who had bled for their own honour. The United States, having tipped the balance of the war, stood poised to become a global power, though Wilson's dream of a League of Nations would falter in the Senate. Brazil and other Latin states reconsidered their place in the world, wondering how neutrality, partial involvement, or alliance would shape their futures. Workers, soldiers, and intellectuals returned home with new questions about justice, democracy, and modernity. The Great War had seemed at first a distant European quarrel, but by 1918 it had redrawn the mental and political map of the Americas. The ocean had proven no barrier to entanglement, but the hemisphere was now tied more tightly than ever to the currents of global power, and the next decade would reveal both opportunities and crises born from this first great world conflict. Part 7, 1918-1929. Aftermath of the Great War and the America's New Path. The cannons of November 1918 had barely cooled when the Americas began reckoning with the cost and the promise of the Great War. Soldiers returned to their homes, often scarred in body or spirit, while governments tried to translate wartime sacrifice into lasting influence. Across the hemisphere, from Washington to Ottawa, from Buenos Aires to Mexico City, the decade after World War I brought triumph, turbulence, and transformation. In the United States, President Woodrow Wilson stepped onto the world stage with bold ideas. He believed the war had been fought not simply for power, but for principles, self-determination, democracy, and lasting peace. His 14 points, announced in early 1918, called for open diplomacy, free trade, and the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. When Wilson travelled to Paris in 1919, he was hailed as a prophet. Crowds cheered him as the man who would reshape the world. For many Latin American and Caribbean leaders, Wilson's rhetoric offered a glimpse of hope. Perhaps the old order of imperial dominance could finally give way to a fairer system, but reality was harsher. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany with crushing reparations and territorial losses, decisions made largely by Britain and France, not by Wilson. The US Senate, deeply skeptical of entangling alliances, rejected membership in the League of Nations. The dream of a new international order was left weakened, and the United States turned inward, focusing on prosperity at home. That prosperity, at least for much of the 1920s, seemed dazzling. The United States emerged from the war as the world's largest creditor nation. Its industries, turbocharged by wartime production, now led global markets. Automobiles rolled off Henry Ford's assembly lines in the millions, radios crackled in living rooms, and skyscrapers rose in New York and Chicago. The 1920s became the Roaring Twenties, an era of jazz, consumerism, and cultural experimentation. Yet beneath the glitter, social tensions simmered, racial violence surged in the Red Summer of 1919, labour strikes shook industries, and a wave of nativism fueled restrictive immigration laws. Canada's post-war path was equally complex. The sacrifices at Vimy Ridge and other battles had forged a new sense of national identity, and in 1919 Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles separately from Britain, a subtle but important step toward independence. The country joined the League of Nations in its own right, another symbol of growing autonomy. Yet domestic strains were heavy. Returning veterans demanded jobs, inflation stoked labour unrest, and the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike revealed deep class divisions. French-English tensions, exacerbated by the conscription crisis, continued to shape politics. Still, Canada entered the 1920s more confident, increasingly asserting itself as more than a colonial appendage. In Latin America, the war's aftermath rippled unevenly, barred unevenly. Brazil, having sided with the Allies, hoped its contribution would bring recognition. At the Paris Peace Conference, it sought a seat at the global table, but was largely sidelined by European powers. Disappointed, Brazil turned its energies inward, debating modernization and democracy while facing economic volatility. Argentina, which had remained neutral, emerged with strengthened trade ties, but also with heightened internal tensions as workers organized strikes inspired by global labor movements. In Mexico, the revolution still smoldered. By the 1920s, leaders like Alvaro Obregón and later Plutarco Elias Calles consolidated power, balancing radical reforms with pragmatic diplomacy. Mexico's oil became an object of US interest, while revolutionary ideals inspired movements across the hemisphere. Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean islands felt the tightening grip of US influence. American corporations expanded control over sugar, bananas, and oil. In Haiti and the Dominican Republic, US Marines remained as occupying forces, shaping institutions and economies in ways that generated both order and resentment. For many in the Caribbean, Wilson's talk of self-determination rang hollow. The 1920s were also a time of rising nationalism in Latin America. Intellectuals and students questioned the old elites and foreign domination. Movements in Peru, Colombia, and Chile called for social reform and recognition of indigenous rights. Writers and thinkers blended European ideas with local traditions, forging new cultural identities. The example of the Russian Revolution of 1917 inspired radicals, while the apparent prosperity of the United States fascinated reformers and critics alike. By mid-decade, the US had embraced a new style of diplomacy in the hemisphere, a mix of economic penetration and military presence, often called a dollar diplomacy or a gunboat diplomacy. American banks extended loans, corporations built infrastructure, and Marines landed when instability threatened US interests. The Panama Canal, completed in 1914, had become a symbol of both engineering triumph and imperial reach. Washington insisted that stability in the Americas was essential for global security, but for many Latin Americans it felt like a new form of empire. Still, the decade was not only defined by conflict. Trade expanded, cities modernized, and cultural exchanges flourished. Jazz spread southward, while Latin American music and dance found eager audiences in New York and Paris. Airplanes began to shrink distances across the hemisphere. For ordinary people, the 1920s brought both hardship and hope, inflation and strikes for some, new consumer goods and urban opportunities for others. As the decade drew to a close, however, storm clouds gathered. The prosperity of the United States masked fragility in the global economy. Agricultural prices fell, debt mounted, and speculation soared. In Latin America, dependence on exports left nations vulnerable to external shocks. By 1929, the fragility would be exposed in dramatic fashion, but for now, the Americas basked in the illusion of stability, unaware of the upheavals to come. Part 8. 1929-1939, the Great Depression and the Americas between fascism and democracy. In October 1929, the illusion of endless prosperity collapsed overnight. The stock market crash in New York sent shockwaves not just through Wall Street, but across farms, factories, and households in every corner of the Americas. It was not just an economic failure, it was a human one. Men and women who had believed in the promise of the Roaring Twenties suddenly found themselves staring into the abyss of hunger, unemployment, and despair. In the United States, banks closed by the thousands. Families lost their homes, their farms, their savings. Farmers who had worked the soil for generations saw the land itself turn against them as drought and dust storms ravaged the Great Plains. The Dust Bowl was not only an environmental disaster, it was a migration tragedy. Families loaded their belongings into battered trucks and set out westward toward California, hoping for work, dignity, survival. For many, they found only labor camps and exploitation. Cities were no better. Soup kitchens stretched down the blocks. Men stood in lines not for jobs, but for bread. Pride was broken, and with it, faith in the American system. For a nation that had believed itself exceptional, the crisis was a wound to the soul. Out of this despair, new leadership emerged. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered the White House with a message of hope, a New Deal for the American people. His fireside chats, broadcast over the radio, brought comfort into living rooms. The calm voice of a president promising that the government would not abandon its people. The New Deal programs were vast. Public works to build dams and roads, social security to provide dignity in old age, labour protections for workers long exploited. Not everyone was saved, not every wound was healed, but faith slowly began to flicker again. The government, once seen as distant, had stepped into the role of guardian. Canada's struggle mirrored the United States, but carried its own burdens. Export-driven and dependent on wheat and timber, Canada was devastated when global markets collapsed. The prairie provinces were hit hardest, where falling grain prices and drought combined to ruin entire communities. Unemployment soared, and in 1935 thousands of desperate men boarded boxcars in the Yonge-to-Ottawa trek, demanding relief from a government they saw as indifferent. The trek ended in violence in Regina, but it left a permanent scar on the national conscience. Yet even in hardship, Canada was reshaping itself. Labour unions grew, political movements like the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, future NDP, were born, and the foundations of a more social democratic future were laid. In Latin America, the Depression cut even deeper. Nearly every nation depended heavily on exports: coffee in Brazil, beef and grain in Argentina, copper in Chile, sugar in Cuba, oil in Mexico. When global demand collapsed, so too did entire economies. Plantations closed, ports emptied, and workers filled the streets with protest. Old oligarchies and elites, once secure in their wealth, now faced rebellion from below. Brazil saw the rise of Getúlio Vargas, who seized power in 1930 amid the ruins of the old order. Charismatic and shrewd, Vargas promised a new vision for Brazil: modernization, industrialization, and a closer bond between the state and the working class. His rule mixed populism with authoritarianism, giving workers rights on paper but demanding loyalty to the state in return. To some, he was a savior. To others, a dictator cloaked in paternal care. In Mexico, the revolutionary legacy collided with Depression realities. Land reform and nationalist policies continued under leaders like Lázaro Cárdenas, who would soon become famous for expropriating foreign oil companies. Workers and peasants found their voices strengthened, while elites and foreign investors bristled. The crisis pushed Mexico toward defining its independence, not only in politics but in economics. Elsewhere, instability turned darker. In Argentina, military coups toppled governments, giving birth to the so-called infamous decade. Chile, dependent on copper exports, endured misery so severe that families abandoned children they could no longer feed. Across the continent, workers' strikes, student protests, and political upheavals became daily reality. And yet, in this same period, the shadow of Europe fell heavily on the Americas. Fascism rose in Italy under Mussolini, Nazism in Germany under Hitler, and militarism in Japan. Their ideologies of strength, nationalism, and contempt for democracy did not remain contained to Europe. In Brazil, integralist movements waved the green shirt banners of homegrown fascism. In Argentina, sectors of the military and society looked admiringly towards the order imposed by Mussolini. Even in the United States, figures like Father Charles Coughlin used the radio to spread messages tinged with authoritarian sympathy. Democracy seemed fragile, its promises questioned in a world of hunger and rage, but there was resistance too. In Uruguay, intellectuals defended liberal democracy. In Mexico, Cardenas fostered workers' organizations to build a new kind of national unity. In the Caribbean, poets and thinkers launched the negritude and indigenismo movements, affirming cultural pride against colonial and racist oppression. And in the United States, despite the allure of extremist solutions, Roosevelt's steady leadership kept the Republic committed to democracy. The decade closed with uncertainty. By 1939, economic recovery was fragile, uneven, and incomplete. The Americas had been reshaped. Governments were more powerful, people more politically active, ideologies more contested, and on the horizon, a new storm gathered. The rise of fascist regimes abroad, combined with the memory of suffering at home, would soon drag the hemisphere once more into global conflict. The Great Depression had humbled empires and cracked societies wide open. It had forced millions to question not just their governments, but the very meaning of justice and survival. Out of the ashes came new leaders, new movements, and new identities. The Americas stood at a crossroads between democracy and dictatorship, between dependence and sovereignty, between fear and hope. Part 9. 1939-1945, World War II and the Americas' fight for the future. In September 1939, when Hitler's armies stormed into Poland and Britain and France declared war, the Americas watched with unease. Memories of the last World War still lingered, scars not yet faded, and few wished to be pulled again into Europe's slaughterhouse. Yet the tide of history was not to be stopped. By the end of the decade, the entire hemisphere would be drawn, willingly or unwillingly, into the greatest conflict mankind had ever seen. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt walked a delicate line. The American people were weary of foreign entanglements, scarred by the loss of 1917-18 and bound by neutrality laws. But Roosevelt saw the danger clearly. Fascism threatened not only Europe, but the entire global order. With his fireside chats and speeches, he began to shift public opinion. He spoke of America as the arsenal of democracy, a nation that, even if not yet in the fight, would provide weapons, ships, and supplies to those battling tyranny. Factories roared back to life, producing planes, tanks, and ammunition. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The image of a Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of determination and pride. Canada had no such hesitation. When Britain declared war in 1939, Canada followed within days, asserting its independence by making the decision separately but aligning with the mother country. The sacrifice would be immense. Over 1 million Canadians served in uniform, and tens of thousands would never return. The Royal Canadian Navy escorted convoys across the treacherous North Atlantic, battling German U-boats that sought to starve Britain into submission. Canadian soldiers fought in Hong Kong, in Italy, and on the beaches of Normandy. Deep in 1942, they suffered terrible losses, but their courage foreshadowed the day when Allied forces would return stronger. For Canada, World War II was both tragedy and transformation, a nation once again proving its place on the global stage. Latin America's role was more complex. Geography gave the hemisphere a strategic shield, but also a responsibility. The Panama Canal became a lifeline of global shipping, heavily guarded by American troops. German submarines prowled the Caribbean and South Atlantic, sinking merchant vessels from Brazil, Mexico, and the Caribbean islands. Slowly, nation by nation, Latin America moved closer to the Allied cause. Brazil was the most decisive. In 1942, after repeated U-boat attacks on Brazilian ships, President Getúlio Vargas declared war on Germany and Italy. Brazilian troops, the FEB Força Expedicionária Brasileira, would later fight in Italy, their banner of the smoking snake mocking those who once said, "A Brazilian snake will smoke before soldiers march to war." Thousands of Brazilians proved those skeptics wrong, marching and fighting alongside the Allies. Mexico, too, joined the fight after the sinking of its oil tankers by German submarines in the Gulf. Under President Avila Camacho, Mexico declared war in 1942 and contributed in ways both symbolic and material. The 201st Fighter Squadron, known as the Aztec Eagles, flew combat missions in the Philippines, a small but powerful symbol of Mexico's entry onto the global stage. Mexican workers also crossed the border to fill labor shortages in US fields and factories through the Bracero program, linking the destinies of the two nations even more tightly. Elsewhere in Latin America, alliances were shaped by both principle and pressure. Chile and Argentina hesitated, torn between economic ties to Germany and fear of US dominance. Fascist sympathizers were not rare. German immigrants in southern Brazil and Argentina, Italian communities in Uruguay, right-wing officers and intellectuals, many admired the order and power of Mussolini or Hitler. In Buenos Aires, whispers of Nazi influence stirred rumors of secret deals and hidden support. Yet by 1945, as the Axis collapsed, even the reluctant states had broken relations with Germany, aligning with the victors, if not out of conviction, then out of necessity. The Caribbean islands, under British, French, Dutch and American control, became vital bases for naval patrols and air operations. Puerto Rican soldiers served with distinction in the US Army. Cuban and Dominican workers supported Allied supply lines. The war reached every shore, every port, every family in ways big and small. For the United States, the turning point came on December 7, 1941, when Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor. Isolationism vanished in a single morning of fire and smoke. Roosevelt's words, a date which will live in infamy, carried the nation into total war. Factories shifted into overdrive, unemployment vanished, and American might began to tilt the balance. By 1944, US soldiers were storming the beaches of Normandy, Marines were raising the flag on Iwo Jima, and bombers darkened the skies over Germany and Japan. The war was not only fought abroad. At home, it reshaped society. African American soldiers demanded dignity as they served in segregated units, laying seeds for the coming civil rights movement. Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, a stain on democracy in a time of war. Women proved indispensable in industry and service, though many were expected to surrender their jobs once peace returned. The war cracked open old prejudices, and while not all were healed, the struggle planted demands for justice that would grow in the decades to follow. As 1945 dawned, the Americas stood transformed. Canada, once colonial, was now independent indeed, if not yet in every law. Latin America had tasted both the dangers of fascism and the influence of US power, some nations aligning willingly, others resentfully. Brazil's troops had marched through Italy. Mexico's pilots had flown in Asia. The hemisphere had become inseparable from the fate of the world, and in the United States the war had ended not only in victory, but in a revelation of power. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 made America the most powerful nation in history, and also the bearer of a terrifying new responsibility. As celebrations erupted in Times Square and in plazas across the hemisphere, few yet grasped the full meaning of this new world. The Americas had entered World War II as diverse, fractured societies, some strong, some fragile, some dreaming of empire, others clinging to survival. They emerged united by sacrifice, but also divided by power. A new age was coming, one where the United States would dominate, where Canada would redefine itself, where Latin America would seek independence of spirit against the shadow of its northern neighbour. The war was over. It's over. But the struggle for identity, sovereignty, and justice in the Americas was only just beginning. Part 10. 1945-1959, the Cold War dawn in the Americas. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, but in that silence a new storm gathered. Across the ruins of Europe and Asia, two giants emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. One wielded the promise of democracy and capitalism, the other the vision of communism and revolution. Their rivalry soon spilled into every corner of the world, and the Americas, bound by geography and history to the United States, found themselves thrust into the first battles of the Cold War. For the United States, 1945 was both triumph and burden. It stood as the most powerful nation on Earth, its cities untouched by war, its industries booming, its atomic bombs unmatched. Yet power brought fear. The Soviet Union, once an ally, now loomed as a rival. Washington vowed that communism must not spread. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe. But the fight for influence extended beyond the Atlantic. The US declared the entire Western Hemisphere a zone of special concern, reinforcing the old Monroe Doctrine with new urgency. In Canada, the post-war years brought pride and transformation. The nation had sacrificed dearly in the war, and now its voice was stronger. In 1949, Canada joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, cementing its role as a middle power committed to collective defense. Canadian troops trained for a new kind of war, one fought in the shadows of nuclear fear. At home, a wave of prosperity lifted living standards, but the discovery of a Soviet spy ring in Ottawa in 1945, the Guzenko affair, shocked the nation and reminded Canadians that the Cold War was not a distant struggle, but one already at their doorstep. In Latin America, the post-war years carried both hope and tension. Many nations had contributed to the Allied cause, and they expected recognition. Instead, they often found themselves sidelined as Washington focused on Europe and Asia. Still, the US sought to secure loyalty in its backyard. The Organization of American States, OAS, was founded in 1948, a symbol of hemispheric unity, but also, critics argued, a tool of US dominance. Mexico entered this new era balancing revolution and pragmatism. President Miguel Alemán pushed modernization, building dams, roads, and industries. Cities swelled as peasants left the countryside, drawn by the promise of work, but inequality persisted, and the revolutionary ideals of land reform often faded against the demands of industrial elites. The Bracero program continued, sending Mexican laborers north to American fields, knitting the destinies of the two nations ever tighter. Brazil faced its own crossroads. Vargas, the wartime leader, was briefly out of power, but his populist legacy lingered. In the 1950s, he returned as president, caught between workers' demands and elite suspicion. His suicide in 1954, leaving behind a letter accusing foreign powers and domestic enemies of betrayal, shook the nation to its core. For millions of Brazilians, it was a tragic symbol of the struggle between national sovereignty and outside influence. Elsewhere, the Cold War stirred deep passions. In Guatemala, a small nation with vast inequality, hope rose under President Jacobo Arbenz, who began land reforms, challenging the power of the United Fruit Company, a US corporate giant. This smelled of communism. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup, overthrowing Arbenz and plunging Guatemala into decades of instability and violence. For many in Latin America, this was proof that US rhetoric about freedom often masked the defense of its own interests. In Cuba, the 1950s boiled with unrest. Corruption festered under Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship. Casinos glittered for tourists even as ordinary Cubans struggled. Into this discontent stepped young revolutionaries, among them Fidel Castro, who in 1953 led a failed attack on the Moncada barracks. Though imprisoned, Castro's defiance electrified many. The seeds of revolution had been planted, seeds that would soon grow into a storm that would shake the hemisphere. Throughout the Americas, people felt the Cold War in their daily lives. School children in the US practiced a duck and cover drills against nuclear attack. In Canada, radar stations dotted the Arctic as part of the Dew Line, watching for Soviet bombers over the pole. In Latin America, students, workers and peasants debated capitalism and socialism, nationalism and imperialism, often in the streets, sometimes with blood. By the end of the 1950s, the mood was one of tension and transformation. The United States enjoyed unprecedented prosperity, but also carried the weight of global leadership. Canada stood taller on the world stage, loyal to the West, but determined to define its own identity. Latin America, restless and unequal, teetered between reform and revolution, its people inspired by dreams yet wary of foreign control. The Cold War had only begun, but its battles, open and hidden, political and cultural, economic and military, had already marked the Americas deeply. A new age was dawning, one in which ideology, fear, and hope would collide across every border, every city, every field. The question was no longer whether the Americas would be drawn into global conflict. but what role they would choose to play in shaping the destiny of the modern world. Part 11. 1960s, Revolutions, Rivalries and Rights. The 1960s arrived with a thunderclap in the Americas. It was not merely a new decade, it was a time of upheaval, dreams and confrontation, when entire nations stood at crossroads and when ordinary people found themselves pulled into struggles that felt larger than life. The Cold War reached its most dangerous moments, revolutions flared, and movements for justice shook the very foundations of old systems. In January 1959, Fidel Castro and his band of revolutionaries marched triumphantly into Havana. Batista had fled, and Cuba was reborn. To the poor and forgotten, the revolution promised dignity, land and hope. To Washington, it looked like a storm on its very doorstep. At first, the US hesitated, unsure whether Castro was simply a nationalist reformer or a dangerous radical. But soon, as land reforms struck at foreign companies and Cuba turned toward the Soviet Union, the lines hardened. By 1961, the showdown was unavoidable. Exiled Cubans, backed by the CIA, launched the Bay of Pigs invasion. They hoped to spark an uprising, but instead they were crushed on the beaches. For Castro, it was proof of US hostility. For John F. Kennedy, a young president barely months in office, it was a humiliation. The Cold War in the Americas was no longer theoretical. It was burning, real, and only miles from Florida's shores. The crisis deepened the following year. Soviet ships brought missiles to Cuba, setting off the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, perhaps the most dangerous moment in human history. For 13 days, the world held its breath. In Washington, Kennedy weighed airstrikes and invasion. In Moscow, Khrushchev warned of retaliation. In Havana, Castro demanded resistance, even nuclear war if necessary. On television, families across the Americas watched as their leaders danced on the edge of annihilation. Finally, through secret back channels, a deal was struck. Soviet missiles would be withdrawn. US pledged not to invade Cuba, and quietly, American missiles in Turkey would also be removed. The world exhaled, shaken, forever aware of how close it had come to disaster. Yet Cuba's revolution was only the beginning of a wider storm. Across Latin America, students, peasants and workers saw in Castro a symbol of defiance. Guerrilla movements sprouted in Nicaragua, Colombia, Bolivia and beyond. Washington responded with the Alliance for Progress, promising aid and development. But too often, aid was tied to obedience, and when left-wing movements gained ground, the US supported military coups. Democracies faltered, and soldiers in dark uniforms seized power in the name of stability and anti-communism. In South America, the 1960s were a cauldron. In Brazil, a military coup in 1964 toppled President João Goulart, ushering in decades of dictatorship. In Chile, debates over socialism versus capitalism sharpened. In Bolivia, revolutionary fighters inspired by Cuba, including the legendary Che Guevara, tried to ignite rebellion. His death in 1967 at the hands of Bolivian troops aided by the CIA turned him into a martyr, his face a global icon of resistance. But the revolution of the 1960s was not only fought with guns. In the United States, a tidal wave of change came from within. The civil rights movement rose with unstoppable force, led by voices that echoed like thunder. Martin Luther King Jr., preaching nonviolence and justice, stood at the Lincoln Memorial and spoke of dreams that touched every heart. Rosa Parks had already sat with quiet defiance, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott. Across the South, young activists braved dogs, fire hoses and prisons to demand the right to vote, the right to dignity, the right to simply exist as equals. But the struggle was not peaceful everywhere. Malcolm X and the Black Power movement reminded America that patience had limits. Cities erupted in flames as anger at poverty and racism boiled over. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 struck the decade like hammer blows, leaving wounds that would never fully heal. In Canada, the 1960s were also transformative. The nation embraced a new identity, shedding old colonial shadows. Under Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, Canada adopted the maple leaf flag in 1965, a bold symbol of independence. Social programs expanded, healthcare moved toward universality, and the idea of a distinct Canadian path, not merely an echo of Britain or the US, grew stronger. Yet tensions brewed too. In Quebec, the Quiet Revolution unleashed calls for modernization and autonomy, sparking debates about language, culture, and the future of Confederation itself. The dream of a bilingual, bicultural Canada was tested in ways that would shape its destiny. Across the hemisphere, youth rose up. Music, art, and protest blended into one. Bob Dylan sang of change, the Beatles echoed across radios, and Latin American folk singers carried guitars like weapons of truth. In Mexico City in 1968, as the Olympics prepared to showcase modern progress, students filled the streets demanding freedom. Days before the games began, troops opened fire at Tlatelolco, killing hundreds. The promise of reform drowned in blood, a grim reminder that the dreams of the 1960s came with terrible costs. By the decade's end, the Americas stood transformed. The US had landed men on the moon, but struggled to find peace on Earth. Canada had forged a new identity, but wrestled with internal divisions. Latin America oscillated between hope and fear, revolution and repression. And Cuba, small but defiant, stood as a symbol of resistance, a reminder that the Cold War was never just about superpowers, but about people, farmers, workers, students, who believed their futures could be rewritten. The 1960s were an age of dreams and nightmares, of progress and pain. They left behind martyrs, revolutions, and movements that would echo long into the future. The Americas could no longer retreat into the past. They had stepped onto the stage of history, loud and unflinching, with all their contradictions laid bare. Part 12, 1970s, Shadows of Power and Cracks in Faith. The 1970s began not with triumph, but with uncertainty. The Americas entered a decade scarred by wounds of war, haunted by coups and dictatorships, and shaken by crises of trust. It was a time when ideals collided with betrayal, when voices of the people were silenced by the crack of rifles, and when even the mightiest nation on earth questioned its own soul. In the United States, the decade opened under the shadow of Vietnam. The war had drained blood, treasure, and faith. By 1973, American troops withdrew, leaving behind haunting images, helicopters lifting from rooftops, villages burned, soldiers weary and broken. The US had not been defeated militarily, but spiritually. A nation once convinced of its destiny now wrestled with doubt. Young veterans returned to streets where anti-war protesters jeered. Others were welcomed only by silence. For the first time in generations, America's power looked fragile. And then came Watergate. What began as a quiet break-in at Democratic headquarters unraveled into a scandal that tore at the fabric of democracy itself. The revelations of corruption, cover-ups, and abuse of power reached the highest office. In 1974, Richard Nixon became the first US president to resign. The image of him boarding the helicopter, giving a stiff farewell wave, became a symbol of betrayal and the loss of innocence. Americans were left asking, if they could not trust their leaders, what could they believe in? But even in turmoil, change stirred. The women's liberation movement pushed forward, demanding equality in workplaces, universities, and homes. Activists fought for the Equal Rights Amendment, for reproductive rights, and for recognition that half the population could no longer be silenced. At the same time, environmental consciousness bloomed. The first Earth Day in 1970, the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, and growing alarm at pollution. Out of disillusionment, new movements of hope and reform emerged. North of the border, Canada faced its own crossroads. The 1970s were years of identity, tension, and transformation. Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau embodied a confident, charismatic style, determined to forge a distinctly Canadian path. But unity was fragile. In 1970, the October crisis shook Quebec. The militant FLQ kidnapped officials demanding independence. When a cabinet minister was murdered, Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, deploying troops in Canadian cities. Civil liberties were suspended, and Canadians debated fiercely. Was it protection or oppression? Oh. Yet the decade also brought milestones. Canada strengthened bilingualism, expanded social programs, and welcomed new immigrants who reshaped its culture. Hockey rivalries with the Soviet Union, especially the legendary 1972 Summit Series, became more than sport. They were moments of national pride, Canada standing tall against Cold War giants. The maple leaf flag flew higher, but questions about unity and identity lingered in every province and every language. Further south, Latin America bled under the weight of dictatorship. The US, obsessed with halting communism, often looked the other way or directly aided coups. In 1973, Chile's democracy was shattered when General Augusto Pinochet overthrew President Salvador Allende, the first Marxist elected in free elections. Bombs fell on the presidential palace in Santiago, and Allende's last defiant words crackled across the radio before he died. What followed was a reign of terror. Thousands disappeared, tortured, exiled. Fear stalked the streets, and yet the dream of freedom smouldered quietly, waiting. In Argentina, the military seized power in 1976, launching the Dirty War. Mothers walked the plazas, holding pictures of vanished children. Their silent marches became symbols of resistance, proof that even in darkness, courage endured. In Brazil, the dictatorship tightened its grip, silencing dissent with prisons and censorship. In Uruguay, once a beacon of democracy, repression spread. Across the continent, military uniforms ruled, but behind them stood the shadow of Washington, funneling money, training officers, and whispering of stability while silencing liberty. Yet Latin America was not only a story of despair. Cultural revolutions flourished. Music, art, and literature carried voices that regimes could not fully silence. The novels of Gabriel Garcia Marquez spoke of magical realism, of truth hidden in stories. Folk songs carried hidden protest. Even as dictators sought control, people found ways to dream, to resist, to survive. And in Cuba, Castro stood firm, defying the US and aligning with the Soviet Union. Cuban troops sailed to Angola, proving that even a small island could project power across oceans. Washington tightened embargoes, while exiles in Miami plotted, waiting for a day of return. The island pulsed with both pride and hardship, its people caught in the endless storm of Cold War rivalry. The 1970s were years of contradictions. Oil shocks and economic crises rippled across the hemisphere, reminding nations of their vulnerability. Social movements surged. Women, indigenous peoples, and the poor demanded dignity. Technology advanced, but so did weapons. Dreams of freedom clashed with the reality of fear. By the end of the decade, the Americas were restless. The US sought to rebuild faith after Watergate, electing Jimmy Carter, a man of modesty and morality, who promised human rights as a guiding principle. In Canada, debates over Quebec, multiculturalism, and sovereignty deepened. In Latin America, dictatorships seemed unshakable, yet resistance burned underground. The 1970s closed like a gathering storm, with the sense that the struggle for justice, freedom, and identity had only begun. The decade had shown that power could be corrupted, democracy could stumble, and fear could dominate. But it had also revealed that the human spirit, mothers marching for their children, students singing in defiance, ordinary people daring to dream, could never be completely broken. Part 13. 1980s, climax of the Cold War in the Americas. The 1980s opened with fire in the skies and fear in the hearts of millions. Across the Americas, the Cold War reached its bloodiest chapters, where jungles, villages, and city streets became battlegrounds in the global rivalry between Washington and Moscow. It was a decade of superpower showdowns, crushing debts, and bold transformations when dictatorships began to fall, but hope was still fragile, and when ordinary people were forced to choose between silence and survival. In the United States, Ronald Reagan strode into power in 1981 like an actor stepping onto the stage. With his Hollywood smile and fiery rhetoric, he promised to restore America's pride. To him, the Soviet Union was not just a rival, but an evil empire, and Central America became one of the front lines of his crusade. Billions of dollars flowed into armies, militias, and covert operations. Washington declared that communism would not be allowed to plant its flag in the hemisphere. In Nicaragua, the Sandinista Revolution of 1979 had overthrown the corrupt Somoza dynasty. Young revolutionaries, inspired by Marxism and liberation theology, promised literacy, healthcare, and land for the poor. But to the US, Nicaragua was another Cuba in the making. The CIA armed and funded the Contras, former soldiers and rebels who waged a brutal war against the Sandinistas. Villages were burned, civilians massacred, and the nation bled. The war was not just guns and bullets, it was psychological, economic, and deeply personal, tearing families apart. Elsewhere in Central America, the flames spread. In El Salvador, a brutal civil war erupted between a US-backed military government and leftist guerrillas. The countryside became a killing field. In 1981, the El Mazot massacre left hundreds of peasants dead, men, women, and children. The stories of survivors, whispered through tears, revealed the cruelty of a war where ideology consumed humanity. Still, ordinary people fought for dignity, often with nothing more than their voices and their prayers. In Guatemala, the decades-old struggle between indigenous peasants and military rulers reached horrific heights. The army, backed by US aid, launched campaigns of scorched earth against Maya villages, accusing them of harboring guerrillas. Entire communities were wiped from the map. Survivors carried memories of fire, screams, and silence. The genocide scarred Guatemala for generations, even as leaders in Washington insisted it was part of the fight against communism. While Central America burned, Latin America's economies faced a quieter but equally devastating war, the debt crisis. In the 1970s, many governments had borrowed heavily from international banks. When oil prices shifted and interest rates soared, debts became unbearable. By the early 1980s, Mexico declared it could not pay. Soon Brazil, Argentina, and others followed. Entire nations were forced into austerity, cutting schools, hospitals, and food subsidies to satisfy creditors. Streets filled with protests as mothers demanded milk for their children, while governments promised repayments to distant bankers. It was a crisis that showed how financial chains could bind nations as tightly as armies, and yet, amidst repression and hardship, dictatorships began to stumble. In Argentina, the generals who had ruled with fear faced humiliation in 1982 when they launched the Falklands War against Britain. The defeat shattered their credibility. By 1983, democracy returned, fragile but real. In Brazil, massive protests, the Diretas Já movement, demanded direct elections. The military's grip weakened, opening the door for civilian rule. Across South America, people who had once been silenced now shouted in the streets, waving flags, risking bullets, demanding freedom. In Chile, Pinochet's dictatorship endured, but cracks appeared. Students marched, workers struck, and the cry for democracy echoed louder. The fear that had silenced a generation began to loosen, though blood still ran in the gutters. By the late 1980s, even the iron-fisted general would be forced to accept a referendum on his rule. The tide was turning. Canada, meanwhile, experienced its own revolution, not with guns but with words and laws. In 1982, under Pierre Trudeau, Canada patriated its constitution, breaking the last legal ties with Britain. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms became the foundation of modern Canada, guaranteeing liberties and reshaping identity. But unity remained fragile. Quebec, seeking recognition as a distinct society, felt excluded. The constitutional battles of the 1980s were fought not with armies, but with debates that cut deep into the heart of what it meant to be Canadian. Back in the United States, the decade was one of contrasts. Wall Street boomed, fueled by deregulation and speculation, while poverty gnawed at the edges of cities. The crack epidemic spread like wildfire, tearing families apart. The AIDS crisis devastated communities, ignored at first by leaders until activists demanded recognition. Yet amid this turmoil, Reagan's popularity soared, his image bolstered by military build-up, patriotic pride, and a belief that America was standing tall again. By the late 1980s, the unthinkable began to happen. The Soviet Union faltered. In Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev spoke of reform, glasnost, and perestroika. The Cold War ice was cracking. For the Americas, this meant the battles that had defined the century were shifting. In Nicaragua, peace talks slowly began. In El Salvador, whispers of negotiations spread. Across the hemisphere, dictatorships were retreating, and democracy, however imperfect, was rising from the ashes. The 1980s were a decade of fire and frost, of massacres and marches, of debt and defiance, of Reagan's booming voice and mother's quiet cries. They revealed the cruelty of power unchecked, but also the courage of people who refused to surrender. As the decade closed, the Berlin Wall trembled, the Soviet Empire weakened, and the Americas, scarred but unbowed, stood on the edge of a new world. The question that remained was haunting and profound. After so much blood, betrayal, and sacrifice, would the next chapter finally bring peace? Or would new storms rise to take the place of old ones? Part 14, 1990s. The end of an era, the birth of another. The 1990s dawned with a silence so profound it stunned the world. The Cold War, the defining conflict of the 20th century, was over. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union dissolved. And for the first time in half a century, the Americas woke up in a world without their great enemy. Yet victory brought not only pride but questions. What now? What did it mean to live in a world with only one superpower? And what new storms might replace the old ones? For the United States, the moment was intoxicating. Politicians and pundits declared the end of history, a belief that liberal democracy and capitalism had triumphed for good. Washington stood taller than ever, no rival in sight. But the 1990s were not just about military dominance, they were about reshaping the very fabric of the global economy. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, bound the US, Canada, and Mexico into a single economic zone. Supporters promised jobs, growth, and integration. Critics warned of lost industries, exploited workers, and fragile sovereignty. In Mexico, NAFTA arrival was met not with cheers but with gunfire. On the very day the agreement took effect, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, ISLN, rose in rebellion in Chiapas. Indigenous farmers, led by the masked figure Subcomandante Marcos, declared that globalization had no place for the poor and the forgotten. Their wooden rifles and poetic communiques captured the world's imagination. Though their uprising was small in scale, it was a fiery reminder that beneath the promises of free trade lay centuries of inequality and exclusion. Across Latin America, the 1990s became the age of neoliberal reform. For governments slashed tariffs, privatized industries, and opened borders to foreign capital. For elites and international lenders, it was modernization. For millions of ordinary citizens, it was betrayal. Factories closed, unemployment rose, and public services shrank. In Argentina, President Carlos Menem tied the peso to the US dollar, bringing stability, but at a terrible price, mounting debt, corruption, and eventual collapse. In Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso pushed reforms, but favelas swelled with the poor left behind. In Venezuela, austerity measures led to riots known as the Caracazo, where hundreds were killed by security forces. The dream of prosperity often turned into a nightmare of hunger and rage. And yet, the 1990s also carried sparks of hope. Democracies, long suffocated by dictatorship, spread across the continent. Military juntas had fallen, ballots replaced bullets, and new leaders emerged who spoke the language of reform and participation. Civil society organizations, human rights groups, and activists rose with a power unseen before, demanding that never again would their nations bow to fear. In Cuba, however, the collapse of the Soviet Union brought catastrophe. With its patron gone, the island entered the special period. Years of hunger, blackouts, and desperation. Bicycles replaced cars, food was rationed, and families survived on ingenuity. Yet Castro's government endured, defying predictions of collapse. Cuba became a symbol of resistance to some, a stubborn relic to others, but always a reminder that ideology still burned in the hemisphere. Canada, too, faced a defining test of identity in the 1990s. The decade brought prosperity under NAFTA, but also a deep crisis of unity. In 1995, Quebec held a referendum on independence. For weeks, the nation held its breath. Families argued across dinner tables, streets filled with rallies both for and against secession. On the night of the vote, the result was agonizingly close. 50.58% voted to stay, 49.42% to leave. By less than 1 percentage point, Canada remained whole, but scarred. The near break left a lingering ache, a reminder that the dream of one Canada was fragile, and its survival depended on constant negotiation. Meanwhile, in the United States, new challenges tested the lone superpower. Wars no longer looked like Vietnam. They were quick, televised, high-tech. In 1991, American-led forces expelled Saddam Hussein from Kuwait in the Gulf War, showcasing overwhelming might. At home, President Bill Clinton presided over economic growth and the rise of the internet, but scandals and polarization gnawed at politics. For many, the 1990s felt like a golden age of peace and prosperity. Yet beneath the glitter lay growing inequality, simmering cultural divides, and foreign policy choices that would echo into the next century. The Americas of the 1990s lived on contradictions. Globalization promised unity but delivered division. Democracy expanded, yet faith in politicians often crumbled. Borders opened to goods and capital, but walls of inequality grew higher. In the streets of Mexico, the shouts of the Zapatistas. In the plazas of Buenos Aires, the protests of the unemployed. In the polling stations of Quebec, the whispers of almost secession, all told the same story. The Cold War had ended, but the struggle for justice, dignity, and belonging was far from over. By the end of the decade, the world celebrated the millennium with fireworks and music. But in the shadows, new dangers stirred: terrorism, financial instability, and the fragility of globalization. The 20th century had ended with both triumph and turmoil, and the Americas stood ready, if uneasily, to face a new age. Part 15: 2000s Flames, Shadows, and New Colours. The dawn of the 21st century came with celebration, fireworks over cities, promises of a new millennium, dreams of prosperity in a world tied closer than ever by technology and trade. But those dreams shattered in a single morning. September 11th, 2001. A clear blue sky over New York turned into a nightmare of fire and smoke. Passenger planes became weapons, skyscrapers collapsed into dust, and the heart of America was struck with a wound deeper than Pearl Harbor. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost in hours that felt like eternity. The images burned themselves into memory. Desperate faces covered in ash, people running through streets of grey, a flag raised over the rubble. America, the invincible superpower, had been made vulnerable before the world's eyes. The response was immediate and furious. President George W. Bush declared a war on terror. Troops marched into Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban and hunt down al-Qaeda. Later, in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, claiming Saddam Hussein held weapons of mass destruction. The wars were framed as defense of freedom, yet they also stirred questions of power, oil, and imperial ambition. American soldiers patrolled deserts and mountains, but at home, grief hardened into suspicion. Civil liberties narrowed, airports turned into fortresses, and Muslims in America often faced fear and prejudice. The 2000s became an era where security overshadowed freedom. Canada, too, stood shoulder to shoulder with its southern neighbour. Canadian forces deployed to Afghanistan, fighting and dying in Kandahar's harsh landscape. For Canadians, it was one of the most serious military commitments since Korea, and the losses were heavy. Coffins draped in the maple leaf returned home, greeted by grieving families lining the highway of heroes. Yet the sacrifice forged a new chapter in Canada's identity. Not just peacekeepers, but warriors when duty called. In Latin America, however, the 2000s took a very different turn. While the US waged wars abroad, a new political wave surged across the continent, the pink tide. Leftist leaders rose to power, riding on the anger of people left behind by decades of neoliberal reform. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, with fiery speeches and oil wealth, declared a Bolivarian revolution, promising dignity to the poor and defiance to Washington. In Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, once a factory worker, became president, blending social programs with economic pragmatism. Millions were lifted out of poverty under his watch. In Bolivia, Evo Morales, the first indigenous president, brought the voice of the forgotten majority to the center of power. Across Argentina, Uruguay, Ecuador, and beyond, new leaders challenged the old order, rejecting the Washington Consensus and forging alliances among themselves. To some, it was hope reborn, the return of sovereignty, pride, and justice. To others, it was dangerous populism, a threat to democracy itself. The hemisphere became divided not just by borders, but by visions of the future. One shaped by neoliberal globalization, another by dreams of socialism reborn. The US, distracted by its wars in the Middle East, struggled to contain this wave. The Monroe Doctrine, once a badge of dominance, seemed weaker in the face of leaders who openly defied Washington and found new partners in Beijing and Moscow. The Cold War had ended, but a quieter struggle for influence was returning. At home in the Americas, the 2000s were years of turbulence. the financial crisis of 2008 shook the world. In the US, families lost homes, jobs vanished, and the mighty Wall Street banks that symbolized power stood on the edge of collapse, saved only by government bailouts. The anger spilled into the streets, from New York to Mexico City to Buenos Aires. Ordinary people, once promised stability by globalization, found themselves betrayed again. Yet amid fear and uncertainty, moments of resilience shone through. In the rubble of 9/11, firefighters became heroes. In Canadian convoys returning from Kandahar, strangers saluted fallen soldiers with silent tears. In the villages of Brazil, families ate 3 meals a day for the first time. In Bolivia, indigenous children saw their languages spoken in the presidential palace. The 2000s were years of fire and contradiction, terror and hope, war and reform, despair and defiance. The Americas were no longer just the stage of the Cold War. They were players in a new global drama where terrorism, globalization, and the search for justice intertwined. And as the decade ended, the world prepared for yet another turning point: the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the first African-American president of the United States. For many, his victory felt like history itself had shifted. But new storms loomed on the horizon. Wars unresolved, economies shaken, and a hemisphere still struggling to reconcile its dreams with its realities. Part 16. 2010s, Storms of Change, Cracks in the New World. The 2010s began with whispers of revolution, not in the Americas, but across the ocean. The Arab Spring toppled dictators in the Middle East, shaking the global order. Yet its tremors reached the Americas too, reminding people of their own buried frustrations: corruption, inequality, broken promises. The hemisphere stood on edge, waiting to see if new winds of change would sweep across its lands as well. In the United States, hope and despair collided like never before. Barack Obama, the first African-American president, inspired millions with the promise of unity and yes, we can. His election was celebrated as history's redemption, the breaking of an old curse of slavery and segregation. But his years in office revealed how deep America's wounds truly ran. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan dragged on. Partisan division in Washington hardened like stone. The Great Recession's scars left families broken, jobs gone, dreams delayed, gone dreams delayed. For some, Obama symbolized progress. For others, he became a lightning rod for resentment. Polarization tore at America's soul. On one side, movements like Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter demanded justice and equality. On the other, anger fueled by economic loss and cultural fears created a surge of populism. This anger found its voice in 2016 with the shocking rise of Donald Trump, a businessman who promised to make America great again. His fiery rhetoric split households, friendships, and the nation itself. The US, once the confident leader of the free world, seemed trapped in a storm of self-doubt and division. In Canada, the 2010s were marked by both global leadership and domestic reflection. Canada took pride in playing mediator on the world stage, embracing refugees when others closed their doors, speaking for climate action and defending human rights. Yet Canada, too, wrestled with its shadows. The painful legacy of residential schools and the voices of Indigenous communities demanding truth and reconciliation. It was a decade of reckoning, of realizing that peacekeeping abroad meant little if justice was not served at home. In Latin America, the dreams of the pink tide began to unravel. Venezuela, once flush with oil wealth, collapsed into economic chaos under Nicolás Maduro. Shelves emptied, hunger spread, and millions fled across borders. Brazil, after Lula's celebrated years, faced corruption scandals that shook faith in democracy itself. Argentina's economy stumbled again. The wave of leftist unity fractured, and in its place, new leaders rose, some leaning toward conservatism, others toward fiery populism. The 2010s became a mirror of contradictions. In Mexico, drug wars ravaged cities while new populist leader Andrés Manuel López Obrador promised renewal. In Colombia, peace was finally signed with the FARC rebels, ending decades of conflict. Yet violence never fully disappeared. Across the continent, ordinary people demanded dignity, whether in the streets of Chile, the plazas of Brazil, or the protests in Nicaragua. The cry was the same: justice, fairness, and a future worth believing in. Technology transformed the decade. Smartphones, social media, and streaming connected the Americas in ways unimaginable before. A teenager in Toronto could speak instantly with a farmer in Peru. A protest in New York could inspire marches in Santiago. A viral video could topple reputations overnight. But this connection also carried poison. Misinformation spread like wildfire, deepening divides, fueling anger, and creating echo chambers of fear. The Americas in the 2010s felt like a family gathering where no one could agree on the meal. Some clung to old traditions, others demanded new recipes, and the table shook with arguments. Yet amid the chaos, one truth remained: the hemisphere was no longer a background actor in world history. It was a stage where the greatest struggles of humanity, democracy versus dictatorship, unity versus division, hope versus despair, played out in raw human form. As the decade ended, the world sensed the storm clouds ahead. In the US, polarization grew sharper, setting the stage for battles yet to come. In Latin America, protests shook governments from Chile to Ecuador, while corruption scandals toppled presidents. In Canada, identity and reconciliation remained unresolved promises. And looming above all, a shadow neither armies nor politics could ignore: the warning signs of a global pandemic that would soon test every society in ways unimaginable. The 2010s were not an ending. They were the tightening of a bowstring, the intake of breath before a scream, the storm before the hurricane. The Americas stood at the edge of a new century of challenges, torn between the weight of its history and the possibilities of its future. And as the lights of the decade dimmed, one question haunted the hemisphere: had the New World learned enough from its past to face the storms that were coming? Part 17. 2020s, the shattered mirror and the unfinished dream. The 2020s opened not with fireworks, but with silence. Streets emptied, cities froze, airplanes sat grounded on runways. A microscopic enemy, invisible to the eye, yet stronger than armies, swept across the Americas. COVID-19 was not just a pandemic. It was a mirror held up to every nation, showing both their strength and their deepest fractures. In the United States, hospitals overflowed. Sirens wailed through empty avenues of New York. Refrigerated trucks became makeshift morgues. Nurses wept behind fogged face shields, while families said goodbye to loved ones through phone screens. Yet even in the face of this common enemy, America turned inward. Masks became political statements. Lockdowns sparked protests. Vaccines triggered conspiracy wars. The pandemic didn't just test America's healthcare system. It tested its unity, and the cracks were wider than anyone feared. The storm of disease collided with another storm: the 2020 election. As Donald Trump fought for re-election against Joe Biden, the nation felt as if it were choosing not just leaders but realities. Conspiracies, misinformation, and rage swirled across social media. When Biden won, millions celebrated as though hope had returned. But millions more believed the election had been stolen. That belief erupted on January 6, 2021, when the US Capitol, the symbol of American democracy, was stormed by its own citizens. Flags waved, windows shattered, gunshots echoed in sacred halls. The world watched in disbelief as the beacon of democracy flickered under assault from within. In Canada, the pandemic was a test of endurance and compassion. Borders closed, cities slowed, and people mourned. But the maple leaf flew steadily. Canada leaned on community: neighbours leaving groceries at doorsteps, volunteers sewing masks, strangers singing from balconies. The government rolled out aid programs to keep families afloat, though not without criticism. Yet, even as Canada showed resilience, the pandemic exposed deep inequities, especially for Indigenous communities, who faced both higher risks and old scars of neglect. The decade demanded that Canada not only heal from a virus, but confront the unfinished wounds of its history. In Latin America, the pandemic struck brutally. Brazil became one of the hardest hit nations, with mass graves dug in Manaus as the Amazon wept with its people. In Mexico, thousands were lost while leaders argued over masks and medicine. Across Argentina, Peru, and Chile, lockdowns deepened poverty. Families who had just climbed into the middle class slid back into hunger. Yet in the middle of despair, courage flared. Doctors in Havana flew to Italy to help strangers. Community kitchens sprang up in Buenos Aires barrios. Protesters banged pots and pans, not just for food, but for dignity. The pandemic was not the only crisis. The 2020s brought political earthquakes. In Chile, people filled plazas demanding a new constitution to bury the shadow of dictatorship. In Colombia, mass protests challenged inequality. In Brazil, Bolsonaro's populism divided the nation between love and fury. In Mexico, violence raged on even as leaders promised peace. Yet, in each struggle there was a heartbeat, ordinary people refusing to accept silence. And then came climate change. Hurricanes ripping through the Caribbean, wildfires blazing in California and Canada, droughts punishing Central America. It was as though the very earth demanded that the Americas stop fighting among themselves and finally face the future. But through all storms there was resilience. Vaccines brought hope. Communities rebuilt what was lost. Families who mourned also remembered. And amid the polarization, a truth emerged. Democracy, though battered, had not fallen. It stood because people, not governments, not armies, but people, refused to let it die. The 2020s in the Americas were not just about crises. They were about confrontation, with disease, with division, with injustice, with history itself. They were about realizing that the hemisphere, from the icy north to the tropical south, is bound together by shared fates. And so, the grand story of the Americas, from the dawn of independence in 1789 to the turmoil of the 2020s, closes not with an ending, but with a question. Can this vast land of contrasts, of skyscrapers and jungles, of wealth and hunger, of freedom and oppression, finally learn from its past to shape a better future? The Americas are not finished. Their story is still being written, in classrooms and streets, in protests and parliaments, in whispers and songs. And perhaps that is the greatest truth of all. History is not a tale of the past, but a mirror of who we are and who we dare to become. Call to action for your video audience. If you've stayed with this long journey through the history of the Americas, tell me, which moment touched you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and share this story so more people can listen. And if you want me to cover another chapter of history, let me know. Your voice shapes the next story.